I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Significant Changes to the 2021 International Residential Code, IRC, Part 1. My name is Marcy Weaver, and I'll be the Education Team Moderator for today's presentation. Today's webinar will run 1.5 hours. That means that you must be present for 1 hour and 21 minutes of this 90-minute webinar in order to qualify for continuing education credit. The American Wood Council is a registered provider with the American Institute of Architects Continuing Education Systems. Disclaimer, the webinar is intended to provide general information only, does not constitute professional or engineering advice. Note that the webinar is being recorded, and by remaining a participant, you automatically consent to such recordings. This course is copyrighted and not eligible for reproduction. This is the team that is providing this course for you. Our speaker today is our very own Paul Armstrong. Engineering moderator is Director of Educational Outreach, Lori Cook. And behind the scenes is our Education Administrator, Kim Paulson, and myself, Manager of Education and Accreditation, Marcy Weaver. Now I'm going to hand you over to Paul to talk about the IRC.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. This is the webinar part 1 of the International Residential Code Significant Changes. My name is Paul Armstrong, and I will be your speaker for today. This is a little bit about my background. Pretty much it shows that I've been around for a while now. I did start with the City of Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety way back in the day, and then transitioned pretty quickly to the model code organizations in the code development area. And we maintained certainly all of the codes that ICC and back in the day ICBO had as models for us to use in enforcing regulations on the built environment. I've been building official of several jurisdictions. You can see some of the awards, but in this particular case, I've been very involved with the International Residential Code. I was actually the original drafting secretariat to the 2000 edition of the International Residential Code, and we had a great committee. It was a very collegial atmosphere. It was actually a little scary because we just kept going together and catching up with each other over the years and passing along, certainly back in the day, all of the jokes that were passed along through email at that time. I've also been a committee member on the International Residential Code, and then this last cycle that is resulting in the 2024 International Residential Code, I had the opportunity to actually chair the committee itself. So it's been a very interesting and satisfying career. I want to highly recommend that you all get involved. One way or the other, there's local chapters of various groups that actually do address code changes. They try to find out where there are problems in the code, certainly with what they have in front of them in their regions. And there's also new technology that pops up that needs to be incorporated into the code. The other thing I want to talk about is that this particular presentation is based off of a workbook that ICC produces. And you can see at the bottom there, that last bullet, I've had the opportunity to work on the California versions, but ICC produces a significant changes workbook for most of the international codes now. And certainly in this particular case for the International Residential Code. So the 2021 International Residential Code Significant Changes Workbook is a very handy document. It has a lot of graphics. It has all the reason statements that you need, certainly to understand the changes that are in front of you when you go through, if you haven't already, the adoption of the 2021 International Codes. Obviously, we're going to do an overview of the significant changes. This is a compressed version of that. ICC and others have full day presentations on the significant changes to the International Residential Code. And they're very handy, and you do get CEUs for doing those, most of those that I've seen at least, at whenever you can, that kind of a thing. Here are the objectives for today. We're going to identify the differences between the 2018 edition of the IRC and what is in front of us for the 2021 edition. I'll try to explain new code concepts, give some of the background, give some of the reason statements for why these code changes were necessary to pop into the International Residential Code. And we're going to summarize certainly the application and impact of these revisions, not the least of which will be those that revolve around the enforcement of this code. As you saw in my background, I have had the opportunity to enforce the code from time to time, and these particular issues do pop up, and they need to be addressed in the model code. If not, then we have to address them by local adoption. So we have these particular objectives. Again, the best education process, the best education opportunity really that we have is to participate in the code development process. You have all of the experts, and there are people that believe they're experts also, in one room at one time, discussing, debating, arguing over various code changes, various ideas that people think need to be in the codes, most of which, frankly, don't make it into the codes themselves. We're going to start off and go through the International Residential Code. As mentioned earlier, this is part 1 of this particular presentation. Part 2 will finish out the rest of the certainly the main building portions of the International Residential Code. If you are interested in the other portions of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fuel, gas, energy sections, those are separate presentations that you can find through ICC, through local chapters, through other associations that can be very helpful. So we're going to start off, and we're going to just start at the beginning, and we're going to go from chapter 1, and today we'll end up into chapter 3 at least, and then we will obviously start up with part 2 and finish out through chapter 10 at the very least with the time that we have allotted to us. So in chapter 1, we have a very interesting code change, and if you haven't taken one of my webinars, I use that term a lot. I find all code changes interesting, by the way, and I use that term. It is very, very interesting to listen to why certain code changes need to be included or not in the process. But now we actually have a reference to ICC's International Existing Building Code in Chapter 1. Granted, it's a little bit limited in terms of it applies only when, as you can see in the bullet, there are alterations that are a part of a change to a use within the building or an occupancy that are outside of the scope of the IRC. Obviously, it's in an IRC type of structure. And then we have something else coming in. And when we have these alterations, we can now certainly much more easily use the International Existing Building Code to evaluate what may or may not need to be done to make that particular portion safe for the occupants that are going to be using that building in particular. This is the first time we've had a reference to the International Existing Building Code in the residential code. We are starting to see in other parts of the country much more use of the IEBC, including now in California. We're going to start to use not just the prescriptive method that's found in that particular document, but we're going to be able to use the work area method as it will be actually transcribed into the California version of the IEBC. So we have this particular document, it's gaining more acceptance, and we're moving ahead with the use of that, as well as the IRC. We made a big jump. We did not include Chapter 2 in this, all of the definitions, if you will. There are a number of new definitions that you need to review. We just didn't feel that they were as significant, perhaps, as other types of code changes given the time frame that we have. Chapter 2 is our dictionary, it's our glossary, it's the language we speak. And we need to understand those terms and use them appropriately so that we can communicate about the projects that we have either under design, that we're reviewing, or if you happen to be a builder, that you're constructing. So you need to understand all of those. Again, you can find at least those that were identified as significant by ICC staff and others in that workbook for the significant changes for the IRC. This move up to Chapter 3 is a very interesting one. I was a committee member on the residential committee for this one. And actually, a friend of mine submitted this code change on behalf of the, I think it was the LA Basin chapter of ICC, to bring in the potential use of shipping containers for residential projects. Now, obviously, we have this criteria also in the International Building Code, so it can be used for non-residential too. So we do have the reference to section, as you can see here in the slide, 3115 of the IBC. For that, should somebody want to use this for the residential projects that are covered within the International Residential Code. It's very interesting that these containers themselves, everything is contained basically back in the IBC, but we can have these with single-family dwellings that are mostly covered for other areas by the residential code. Many areas, certainly that have transportation types of facilities, have these shipping containers because they become decommissioned after a while and they have to do something with them. We've seen a few projects around here very close to where I live and work that are very interesting. This particular picture actually depicts a multi-story use of shipping containers. We even have a two-story non-residential type of development that is here in Southern California, where I happen to reside. And it's very interesting to see how that is used and that how it was designed. And in talking with the building official, who is a friend, how we had to, or they had to apply the code to that particular project prior to this criteria being done. So we have these particular units that are out there, these shipping containers, and instead of just demolishing them and maybe trying to recycle the steel, typically, that's within, they reuse them, they clean them up, they modify them to be used, in this case, under the residential code for residential projects. Very, very interesting projects. People are very, very creative in their designs of these. Keeping along in section R301, which is our structural loading criteria, really, for the residential code. We have prescriptive criteria in this section that allows us to use the prescriptive criteria that follow in chapters 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth, where we have the various elements of the structure described in the residential code. When I was the original drafting secretariat for the 2000 edition, we envisioned that this criteria that was being presented in the residential code would be for flat lots, very simple rectangular types of floor plates, lots of redundancy in certainly the brace wall panels, brace wall lines that are embodied in it. And we have since, obviously, moved away from that very simplistic approach and have included many other conditions so that we can use the IRC in these areas. In this particular case, we're getting into hillside types of settings. And these hillside settings have conditions that allow us to use the prescriptive criteria, if you will, in setting up the structural framing, the support, for lack of a better term, of these projects using the residential code's prescriptive criteria. You can see that the grade slope, exceeds 1 in 5, if you will, along the length of any exterior side. The cripple wall height exceeds 7 feet, so on and so forth. You can see that we have some criteria that allows for us to use the residential code in these particular sloping conditions. Again, like I said, we didn't envision that way back in the day. It was intended to be a flat lot and a very simplistic type of design. We built in, since the original residential code, many other options, a much more flexible type of criteria for the use of the residential code, rather than going and trying to find a registered design professional to run the structural calculations and prepare the structural framing plans themselves. So we have that now. We can use this code in many more conditions, especially since our new construction is moving out, or has already moved out, of the basic flat lot areas. And in order to build new dwellings, we're having to move into these hillside areas. So this addresses that. The anchorage of water heaters has been around in the codes for a very long time. We understand the need to, in the event of an earthquake, and you can see that we have seismic design categories listed here, to keep that particular element as much as possible in place and somewhat usable after an earthquake. Well, we now have an expansion of this criteria to include not just single-family dwellings and duplexes, but obviously townhomes in seismic design category C as well. Okay, so townhomes would be covered by this criteria in seismic design category C, and all of the D categories that we have listed there. Single-family dwellings and duplexes, this only applies when we're in seismic design category D. And we've expanded the actual type of appliance, if you will, to include various thermal storage units. This recognizes that we're starting to move away, maybe certainly from gas-fired water heaters in various parts of the country, but going into these thermal storage units that are becoming much more prevalent in the systems that are being designed and installed within the dwellings, the residential projects that are covered by the IRC. You can see that we have the criteria for the anchorage of these strapping found in both the mechanical section, chapter 13, and in chapter 28, where the plumbing criteria is. So it's all covered there. We have a very nice reference found in chapter 3, which frankly is perhaps the most used chapter in the residential code. Townhouses. We needed to provide a little bit more clarity to the horizontal continuity of the common walls, if you will, between each townhouse unit. And so in the code, we actually have to say, and I didn't really think that this was necessarily a problem out there, but people pointed out that the code did not say exactly how we would have that horizontal extension or continuity provided when we have, if you will, non-solid exterior walls, okay, which are probably the bulk of the construction out there for townhouse construction. I really like this picture. This is not the world I live in exactly, but it really is and does show, I think, very well the common wall between townhouse units themselves. So we now say, as a general rule, that these townhouse common walls have to extend to the inside of the exterior sheeting of the exterior wall. So it extends through the concealed space of these walls that are not solid. Okay, we're trying to cut off any potential for fire to leapfrog or just move around these walls to gain access to adjacent dwellings, right? And so we've provided this. This is, I think, a clarification in the code, because even in the 2000 edition, the idea was in providing what are effectively dwelling unit separation walls. Okay, they're townhouse common walls is the term we use here. Okay, the idea was to completely separate these units from another adjacent townhouse unit. So we have that now in the code, and the 2021 code is much more clear along those lines. With that being said, we provided another exception. Okay, again, I wasn't sure that this was needed, because I kind of believed that when we have this kind of condition, that if you filled that cavity between the common wall and the inside, if you will, of the exterior sheeting of the exterior wall, if you filled it with, they use the term blocking. Again, technically, I don't know that that's exactly the right term, but they fill it completely with solid wood or whatever the fire blocking material happens to be in that concealed space. So we can then end, from a horizontal continuity standpoint, these common walls at the inside of the exterior wall. We don't have to extend them to, if you will, the exterior sheeting, the inside face of the exterior sheeting of the exterior wall itself. Okay, very fine detail. Okay, we needed to provide that again to meet that goal of completely separating these townhouse units that people live in. Okay, this kind of code change tells me, certainly, that we have a pretty good code, actually, in terms of providing the protection that we're looking for, right? And we're just working with the details now and cleaning up areas that are confusing. Okay, very interesting to see this. And certainly we experienced this during the code change hearings as well. Keeping along those lines, we're moving away from townhouses into duplexes. Obviously, it's 2 units, 2 residential units within a building. Again, I didn't know that this was a problem. In my experience, certainly as a building official, again, I tried to provide complete separation between these dwelling units to protect the occupants from hazards on the other side. But we now have, again, a clarification that these dwelling unit separations, these walls, have to be provided whether there's a real lot line or not between each unit. Okay, apparently there was some question when you would have a duplex on a single lot. The code didn't specifically say that you had to have them, and some people thought that these separations only occurred when you had a real property line in between these units. And so the code is clarifying, certainly the ICC membership has clarified, that these separations shall be provided to provide the protection that we're looking for. So again, very nice clarification. It's part of sort of this theme of just improving the code as we move on into new additions. Keeping along with that, we're still in section R302. This R302 really contains everything that is related to fire resistance. Doesn't have to be fully tested necessarily, but anything that is related to fire resistance falls into this particular section now. And we have, like we have in the building code, we have through penetration and we have membrane penetration criteria. We have, in this particular case, an exception, really, that allows for water-filled sprinkler piping as a through penetration through whatever assembly we're looking at. Okay, whatever assembly is providing the fire resistance that the code intends to protect the occupants. So water-filled sprinkler piping, obviously, for one, the building is fully sprinklered, presumably, with that. That helps a lot. Also, the annular space that is created by creating the hole and then having the pipe run through it, there is a gap. We know that. You can't provide it as a super tight type of a fit to help prevent the passage of flame and other products of combustion through that particular assembly. So that gap, that annular space, has to be filled. Okay, and that's one of the main things about this, because it's not just flame that is a problem, right? In the event of fires, it's smoke. It's other products of combustion that could be a problem for the occupants on the other side. So we give them an opportunity to get out, certainly by providing these fire resistive assemblies with, frankly, the protected openings we're looking for and the penetration protection. Okay, water-filled sprinkler piping to me is kind of a no-brainer because, for one, again, the building is fully sprinklered at that point. And along those lines, membrane penetration. Previously, in the 2018 code, and the terminology is a little bit wonky here, but sprinkler heads were allowed to be a penetration, a membrane penetration, so long as they had a metal escutcheon plate, right? That covered up that annular space so that other types of products of combustion couldn't pass through. Well, we've also included as a membrane penetration, again, the water-filled sprinkler piping as well. Again, if we have that penetration occurring, we want to protect the annular space. In this case, it allows for a metal escutcheon plate. With having this water-filled piping or the sprinkler head, you're going to have a fully sprinklered condition. And as such, that sprinkler system, again, assuming that it is properly designed, it's properly installed, and the like, the sprinkler head is going to control the fire until the fire authorities come in and really suppress the fire at that point. In most cases, it might even suppress the fire itself. But we now have the ability to have these sprinkler pipes go through and actually, serve the dwelling and not have to have necessarily the more expensive penetration fire stopping systems. So we have all of that here now in the code, and this actually, and the one before it, actually technically pulls down the protection a little bit provided by the code. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but we don't have to have the listed, rated types of penetration fire stopping systems in these cases. We just have to fill the annular space or cover it up with a metal escutcheon plate. So it's very interesting, again, to see this. And like I said earlier, this tells me that the protection that is being provided by the residential code really is doing its job. And we're just working with the details now. There has been a lot of work in section R302. And as I mentioned before, a lot of its details. This one has been very, very interesting one to follow over the years. The 2000 edition of the International Residential Code basically had a door. The door did not have to be self-closing, did not have to have a lock or a latch, and the like. And so we have gone through several editions since then, and all of that criteria has come back, including now the requirement for a self-latching door. So when the door closes, you have a little latch that obviously presumably goes into whatever that plate is called and latches and holds that door in place in the event of a fire on either the garage side or the dwelling side, right? Historically, fire loss data shows that most fires start in kitchens. There are some that start in garages. So we have this separation requirement between the garage and the dwelling that's provided. In fact, some of us at least believe we're protecting the garage from fires in the dwelling. But we have the ability now to provide a completely protected opening in this garage dwelling separation. Now, the interesting one is in the last cycle, we actually added automated or automatic closing devices, as well as having a self-closing device on this particular door. So we could have a door using an automatic closing device that could be potentially a sliding partition door. That partition door is going to have to, based on this particular code change, latch in place and not just close and rely on the automatic closer to keep it in place. Okay, very interesting to see this. I have not seen yet an automatic closing device installed in this garage dwelling separation. However, I have been told that there are some larger custom homes where somebody may have a garage that is more like a showplace for their car collection, and they like to have that open to their great room so that they can walk back and forth and enjoy whatever sort of features their vehicles have at the same time. And in the event of a fire, the protection will close that off and make sure that we have the protection we're intending. So very interesting to see this. And it's been a long time, but we're back to having a completely protected opening between the garage and the dwelling. This is a pretty simple code change, and it is kind of a no-brainer, but it has its own challenges, I think. High-density polyethylene, we get some of these plastics, polypropylene as well. They are showing up as interior finish types of products. Okay. They do test these to make sure that they are not producing an inordinate amount of smoke or are making the fire certainly spread a lot faster than it should. Okay, I get that. And in new construction, certainly, or in additions and all of that, I understand. We see this particular product pop up periodically, and it really is a very simple note that occurs in the general sheet of notes more than anything else for the interior finish criteria. Well, that's great. Challenge I have is that there is work that is done, believe it or not, without permits. I know that might be a shock to a lot of you, but it does happen. And homeowners, I am a homeowner myself, have a tendency to run to a big box store and pick up various products and then attempt to at least, or maybe completely install them over a weekend. Well, we are not training, certainly, our homeowners, the occupants of these dwellings, to look for protected, if you will, plastic materials that are going to be serving as whatever feature as an interior finish, right? I have a little bit of challenge with this because these products are sold big box stores or online, and we could be having them installed by people who are well-meaning but really don't know that the code intends to provide, if you will, more protected types of plastic interior finish products than maybe what they're getting overseas from an online type of a service. Okay. I've looked at this one. One of the beauties of working with AWC is that we are concerned with anything and everything related to the built environment for the most part, at least within reason. And been talking with some folks about this to see not what could be done in the code, but maybe if we couldn't get some education out to people through either our local chapters or other associations as to the need for these, tested and listed products. So it's a very interesting code change. It really does highlight the need, though, that we need to be, much more willing to share information about these products to those folks that are actually using them that may not have the experience with the codes. So we have to be careful with anything and everything we do in the codes, and sometimes these code changes highlight a need for education that may or may not be given out there. Okay, R303. We've moved into an area that is part of our housing, if you will, types of regulations that have been built into the residential code. Effectively, the general rule is we have natural light and natural ventilation, right? We have windows that are openable, that kind of a thing. There's been a whole list of exceptions for both over the years. This is a new one. This allows in kitchens only the use of a local exhaust system in lieu of actually providing exterior openings to provide natural ventilation. People have told me that certainly in the section chapter 15 for the mechanical criteria that we're really looking at maybe range hoods or other types of very specifically local exhaust systems that can take the place of the natural ventilation in these kitchens. Okay, a lot of kitchens are open to other rooms and they can have the benefit of whatever system. Maybe it's a whole house fan, or they have openable windows and things of that nature that can allow for the ventilation we're looking for. But in those cases where we don't, this can be a very handy tool. Okay, I probably would not have allowed for this system prior to this if I were the building official of a local jurisdiction. Okay, I would have wanted either the whole house fan or certainly openable windows in these kitchens to provide the ventilation that the code is looking for, but we have this now. So it's a very handy code change. We're getting quite a few exceptions, in this case, to both the natural light and natural ventilation. And I think it makes it much more easy to design and build in certainly urban areas. If we're in a very rural area with lots of land and rambling one-story types of dwellings, that hasn't necessarily been a problem. But when we get into those tighter conditions, more densely populated, sometimes we have to come up with unique ways to provide the ventilation and light in some cases that we're looking for. Keeping along with some of our housing criteria, the ceiling height. Okay, we have a list of exceptions for that. I don't know that I've seen anybody attempt in brand new from the ground up construction ceiling height less than the minimum required by the IRC. I see this particular, effectively, this is again an exception being utilized in the conversion of basements, conversion of attics, conversion of other types of areas into residential spaces. Okay, so this allows for ceiling beams, so long as there's a 3-foot clear, if you will, span between the beams themselves to project down to 6'6" above the floor level. This particular picture kind of shows that it's a lot higher than that, at least to me, it does. I am, or at least I was, 6'4", so this is something that is near and dear to my heart, or near and dear to my head. And, we get very concerned when we have these kinds of projections into these areas, but it is a very effective tool to use for existing conditions and the conversion of those existing conditions. So we have that now built into the code, and it is very handy to have this particular tool to be able to utilize these spaces moving out into the future and get them permitted and safe, and not just converted illegally. EERO. EERO, these are our emergency escape and rescue openings. It's a very unique kind of acronym and all of that. But we've had a lot of changes over the years to the conditions where we have these types of openings and how we provide certainly the spacing, where they're located, that kind of a thing. This particular section, R310.2.4, talks about these openings that are found under decks, porches, and cantilevers of the floor above. Okay, so what this does is it says that if you should have a bedroom or maybe one room in a basement, perhaps, could be an upper story, I suppose, but for the most part, these are really trying to address basement conditions or sloping lot conditions. And it says that the opening itself shall be fully openable. Okay, we get that. And then this is the only time it talks about this pathway away from the emergency escape and rescue opening. It talks about the path being not less than 36 inches high by 36 inches wide and ultimately lead to a yard or a court, which would take you ultimately to the public way, which is the place of safety, if you will, in the code. Well, that's very interesting. For cantilevers of floors above, it probably isn't such a big deal. Maybe it could be in a sloping lot condition where the floor plate of the story above is offset. You may have to provide a 3 foot by 3 foot opening through grade or whatever to the outside. Where some of the big challenges are related, I think, to the creation of the fabrication of the construction of decks, exterior decks. And whether it's a sloping lot or not, you could have a deck that is proposed to be attached to a building or alongside a single family dwelling, let's say, that could be, just hypothetically, 200 feet in depth away or in length away from the dwelling. This criteria does not have travel distance associated with it. This criteria doesn't talk about what the path has to look like. Okay, whether or not the path is illuminated, maintained, anything along those lines. So when you get a deck project that is submitted to a local jurisdiction, we're going to have to know, and we really had to know before, but we're going to have to know if there are any emergency escape and rescue openings in the wall below the deck. Okay? And, you know, frankly, in my mind, we're going to have to identify that there is a path, because it says a path, doesn't give us any length or direction or number of turns or whatever. They're going to have to identify a pathway under this deck that is 3 by 3, leading ultimately, as it says, to a yard or court. Well, that's great. Okay. These emergency escape and rescue openings, however, are not only used by the occupants trying to escape. In fact, the criteria that is developed, and we're going to get into some other criteria here after this particular slide, but the criteria that is developed is really intending to provide the size that is needed for a firefighter in full turnout gear to be able to effect a rescue through that opening. Okay, so being in the business, I have a lot of friends on the fire side. Okay, and they come up to a building and it's on fire. What I've been told that they do, I've never been in close proximity to those kinds of operations during the event, but what they do is they try to walk around the building, or at least identify as much as they can those openings, certainly, that may be emergency escape and rescue openings. Well, there's also no signage that says, hey, under this deck at this point is the pathway to another emergency escape and rescue opening. Okay, So I've got a little bit of trouble with this. I do not want to recommend necessarily that people provide these massive decks. And granted, not many people, if anybody, is going to do anything that's 200 feet, out away from the building by whatever the width of the building is. I get that. But you could create, if you will, a problem for certainly the occupants and the firefighters if there was somebody needing rescue through that open. Okay. Be real careful with this one. Look at this, encourage people, let's educate them. Let's try to see if we can't come up with another means of providing this EERO away from the building itself. Section R310, we've had some changes here. We're still in the emergency escape and rescue opening. If you look at the title, it says alterations or repairs of existing buildings. We had the very first slide that talked about the use of the International Existing Building Code. Again, that's very limited. I get that. But we now have existing building criteria built into the residential code. The residential code, like the building code itself, was intended originally for new construction, and then existing work would be covered by the IEBC, the existing building code. We now have criteria really that is coordinated with the existing building code in the residential code, because frankly, not many people have been using the IEBC, certainly for residential construction, single family dwellings and duplexes and the like. So when we have a change of occupancy, and that does occur in single family dwellings, duplexes, and even in townhomes, we can evaluate these emergency escape and rescue openings to see if they conform to at least a very nominal sized opening as a EERO, right? And you can see the criteria here. The opening area itself is limited as a minimum is 4 square feet in opening. Obviously, you can see the height of 22 inches and the clear width of 20 inches as well. So we're actually kind of whittling down, if you want to look at it that way, the size of these openings in our existing building stock that's out there that was built maybe prior to, in a lot of cases, the development of the International Residential Code or even any code in a particular area. So we can use some of these without having to affect changes in the existing building that may not necessarily be that necessary. Moving on along, we have another exception. This is one that's a little bit weird to me. Okay, we still have the same opening dimensions as we just talked about, the 4 square feet, the 22 inches high, 20 inches wide, that kind of a thing. Okay, and then it says it is the largest window from a given, right, a manufacturer, a given window manufacturer that fits, obviously, and is operable and provides the same or greater dimensions as the existing. Okay, so there's a lot more to look at in this case. When we actually get permit applications for replacement windows, okay, just being honest, we're going to actually have to ask if they want to use this exception for what manufacturer they're using, and we're going to have to ask for a listing of the windows and then evaluate what's the largest window that they provide that would fit this particular opening without altering the rough opening. It actually creates a little more, no, not a little more, a lot more complication, I think, for our counter staff, because frankly, a lot of our retrofit window permit activity is handled at the counters. Okay, we have a lot more to do with emergency escape and rescue openings now, and we've got more at the end of this particular session today that relate to those windows that we have to evaluate. So sorry about that. I was on the committee. I don't remember how I voted because it's probably been about 5 years ago now, maybe more than that. since we actually met on these items. But I have some concerns with this particular one, and mostly with educating our counter staff and those that review plans at the counters, depending on your jurisdiction, if you're, in the enforcement side. It's going to be very interesting for retrofit window types of permit activity moving on. Just seems like every cycle it is. All right. This is actually one of my favorite photos in this slide deck, by the way. It is just one of the creepiest looking stairways I've ever seen. Okay, that was a good choice. There are new exceptions to the application of stairways. We had some of this anyway, but again, this is really a clarification for the application. So we're going to start with the second and third. Stairs serving non-habitable attics. Perhaps this stairway is going up to a creepy attic somewhere that is non-habitable. And so we don't actually apply the stairway conditions, stairway requirements to that stair, because frankly, if it's non-habitable, it could be an opening in the ceiling that you use a ladder. Or maybe you have one of those pull-down ship's ladders and all that, which is allowed or can be allowed depending on the conditions. Stairways leading to crawl spaces is another thing. The controversial one that I've seen, frankly, across the country is the application of that first item. Stairs and ramps. Ramps is next. It's coming up. Stairs and ramps not within or serving the building, deck, or porch. Okay, that's interesting. So what does that mean? If you have a stairway obviously leading up to the main entry door, the front door of the house, that has to comply. That's an easy one. So then you move on from that. Obviously, sliding doors could have stairways leading from them, I suppose. You'd have a landing and then the stairway down. That would have to comply too. We're talking about exterior. Interior, with the exception of the second and third items listed there, all interior stairs have to comply. So we get out and we're in the backyard. And let's say that backyard is 40 acres in size, just for grins. They want to put in a pool, party area, what have you. Okay. Do you apply the stair geometry, the stair conditions, or the ramp conditions for that matter, to those exterior, if you will, not on grade, but sloping conditions? So if you have a sloped backyard and somebody wants to create a little kind of a seating area that has a view over the valley or the ocean or whatever, right? And they go up there and they put pavers down. They bring their picnic table with an umbrella and chairs up there. Do the stairs serving that particular area or the ramp have to comply with the criteria? Well, let me ask you another question. Do they need a permit for that? In most cases, maybe in all cases, the answer is no. So how are you going to enforce the stair criteria on that anyway? There is going to have to be a decision made by the building official as to when we're going to apply this stairway and ramp criteria to these settings. Okay. If they are providing stairs, steps, if you will, up to a little on-grade slide. I know the old slides, the aluminum fiberglass slides are pretty much gone. But if they create their little slide tube sort of a thing going into the pool, do we have to enforce the stair criteria, which could include handrails and so on and so forth on that? Great question. When I am, or when I have been the building official, I have not enforced that. That's up to their own, for one, desire, and two, their insurance and whatnot that comes into play. So the last question is, what about a stair leading from, or a pathway leading from the public way up this very large, beautiful lawn And in the middle, they have a set of steps going up to the upper level, and then they have this kind of a sloped ramp leading up to the front door. Do they, or are they required to comply with the criteria for stairways in that case? Well, since COVID in particular, we've had different services, a lot more services utilizing, if you will, the pathways leading up to our homes, the walkways, the steps, the stairs, whatever is providing up to that front door. Okay, that's our online delivery groups. Now, whether or not we would apply this criteria to that condition, that's a great question. That's up to the local building official. I would say, whatever your stance, encourage people to comply with the criteria, because if you have somebody who is delivering a package or a few packages in some cases to a house or your house, my house, I'm going to want to make sure that that complies, because if they trip and fall, guess what? All of a sudden, suits are going to start showing up, and they're going to start asking very difficult questions, and they're going to probably serve you with a civil case to provide for medical and all kinds of other sorts of issues. So be real careful with this. You know, the online delivery service groups out there have not gone away based on COVID pulling back. If anything, people are still ordering online and having all kinds of things delivered, including my own house. We do the same thing. And so I like to make sure that all that is as complying as possible or as safe as possible. Still in the stairway criteria, this is a new exception. There's a lot of exceptions in the codes these days. We keep adding those, as I said. They're good clarifications. They address different things that pop up. But this allows for the movement of water, which can provide a slipping hazard for people. The general rule is said there in the I guess, second sentence. 2% is still the general rule for the slope. However, if you need to provide a greater slope, you can go up to 5% in the direction of travel only to make sure that water drains from the landing surfaces in particular and on the stairways, because we know that people do slip based on moisture. Okay, so that's in the code now. Here's the ramp criteria. We've already talked about this. It specifically, we don't have, at least I haven't seen many ramps leading up to second stories or whatever within dwellings. I suppose they could, but certainly ramps that are not within or serving a building, deck, or porch, obviously, take a look at this. This is going to be an interesting one moving forward for all of our enforcement communities, but certainly the building officials. Location of smoke alarms. Okay, we effectively have a general rule that provides that they're in each bedroom, hallways serving the bedrooms on each story, that kind of a thing. Okay, now when we have perhaps a great room or a room with a vaulted ceiling that opens to a hall or is adjacent to a hall that opens to that particular room, and the ceiling height difference, to me, the maximum ceiling height difference is greater than 24 inches, then we get a smoke alarm in that, if you will, vaulted ceiling as well. Because what will happen is if there's a fire that is in that vaulted room or in an area or space, maybe the kitchen, that is adjacent to that vaulted ceiling, the smoke is going to fill up that vaulted area first before it gets itself to the hallway to actually actuate the smoke alarm and cause the occupants to egress or control the fire, right? So we've added this particular location in the code so that we know that we get it in these particular cases, and we get the notification that we are looking for the occupants to actually egress out. Carbon monoxide alarms. We get a lot of these too. This is a relatively new, it's been in the code for a few editions, I get it. But initially we didn't have carbon monoxide, any sort of carbon monoxide alarm detection, anything like that. We've got that now. We now have an exception that allows for us to not require the installation of carbon monoxide alarms, again, in existing buildings. When there's some sort of installation, alteration, or repair, as said here, of non-fuel fired systems. So obviously, fuel gas systems get them. We're very interested in particular with fuel gas systems, but if we have some other type of fuel that is being consumed, that is being burned or otherwise utilized in one of these systems, okay, then we're going to ask for carbon monoxide alarms to be installed. Interesting thing about this, and smoke alarms now too, we're getting them installed based on, in certain parts of the country, based on the resale of property, based on all kinds of regulations out there now. The smoke alarm criteria is frankly the #1 life-saving element that we have ever built into the codes. It has saved more lives than anything else that we have provided, even sprinklers, right? Because smoke is the ultimate killer. You don't have to have a fire to have smoke, or at least a raging fire. Okay, so here we have another exception. Certainly, if you're doing counter work and somebody's coming in pulling a permit, we're going to have to look and ask, if you will, what type of system is going in or what are you repairing? And if it is electrical only, we can say, okay, no smoke alarm, no carbon monoxide alarm, you're good to go. If it is fuel gas fired, we have to include that certainly in our inspections, because it's very difficult to do that at the counter. When you go out to conduct your inspection, you may have to ask for the install of a smoke alarm or carbon monoxide alarm, in particular in this case. And hopefully we're educating certainly our contractors that are out there to do this as well. Okay, we made a pretty good jump. We've moved into the protection of wood against decay. Obviously, this is from moisture types of conditions. They have clarified this criteria. They simplified it. They removed the condition where if the building official should happen to know that they don't have these conditions, they can waive it. I don't know of any place that doesn't have these conditions, to be honest. So they kind of pulled that out. We're going to talk a little bit about wood columns here in the next slide. And exposed glulams, it's just been all simplified, and it's much easier to use. So again, this I think may have been an American Wood Council, or at least certainly it's a wood industry type of a code change, and it's been a very helpful simplification of the criteria, because we did used to get a lot of questions when I was serving as building official about the application of this criteria. Here's the wood columns. You can see that they've made it much more specific. You can see that we have 3 items listed here. One is crawl spaces, the other is in contact basically with concrete, that kind of a thing, or masonry, I suppose. We have those conditions. A lot of these are pretty basic. They've again simplified this, made it much simpler to understand and to use. I really do appreciate that, and certainly all the work that goes into trying to address all of the issues in making a simplification to, frankly, a fairly old set of criteria. Accessibility. This continues to be a very interesting topic. Obviously, we're talking about the live-work units in this particular case, and we're concerned about the application of Chapter 11, okay, to this criteria based on the work area of the dwelling. And we clarify, we make very specific that 1108-621, as it says here, applies in this particular case, but the non-residential portion itself is actually covered in Chapter 5 of the IBC. So we have effectively references back to the IBC when we get 4 or more units that are being built, that kind of thing, live work types of units. And we're seeing those more and more in our urban types of settings, not so much in the suburbs, but downtown areas where they're trying to encourage people to come back downtown and revitalize those areas. We're seeing these live work types of systems or facilities pop up. So it's been a good thing to have this here. In other parts of the country, they may amend this 1 degree to 1 degree or another. Always take a look if you have a multiple unit project. Take a look at what you've got in front of you in your locality anyway. Photovoltaic. It's been a huge move to incorporate PV or photovoltaic types of systems. The mounting system now has a listing and labeling. UL 2703 is the standard that is used to provide the testing, if you will, of these systems. It really is criteria for the mounting systems themselves. And as with pretty much every system that's out there, they are installed in accordance with the manufacturer's listing and instructions. Okay, that's actually part of the listing. And so it almost doesn't need to be said, except that we have to be clear that we need those installation instructions out in the field when we're conducting our inspections. So that's built into the code here. We have building integrated photovoltaic types of products out there. Right now, the most common one are photovoltaic roof shingles. And so when we have those there and somebody is trying to use this particular product, how do you provide the separation? How do you identify that, you know, this area is the photovoltaic shingle versus other areas that may not be? In most cases, I've seen the entire roof as these. So how do you have, well, we'll get into some of the other criteria. How do you not provide these, the ventilation areas in the larger, of course, this is residential, but the pathways and the setbacks and whatnot for these systems? Well, the building official has to be shown that the removal or cutting of these types of products, obviously during firefighting operations, is not an electrical hazard. Well, there's always a very slight, at the least, electrical hazard, but it's pulled back so far that it really is more like a low voltage system when they put the photovoltaic system in that mode. Okay, so they can pull it back and it will just be a very light type of electrical feeling, like we have with our low voltage types of systems, and that can be used then to cover the entire roof, and we don't have to provide the ridge separations and the access ways from the eaves and things of that nature. Now, we also have a concern when you have maybe a multi-story building and you have emergency escape and rescue openings. We were talking about this earlier, right? And we have these photovoltaic roof shingles applied. They are applied in total in that roof area. So you're not supposed to, you know, jump out of the window and land on a photovoltaic module, certainly, but we have the same determination that goes in this case as we did in the previous slide. And so the listing, actually the NEC section number is listed there. It's section 690 is all things photovoltaic, but 690.12 B2 is where we find that. And we can have these types of photovoltaic shingles directly below, if you will, these emergency escape and rescue openings. You don't have to have the 3-foot pathway provided to the emergency escape and rescue opening. The challenge that we have had with some of these systems, or at least some of the pushback that has occurred, although they've pulled back quite a bit, is that some of these, well, pretty much all of these roof shingle types of products that have a photovoltaic capacity to them, okay, when they get wet, they get slick. But what was found is that other roofing materials like slate or metal roof metal roofing shingles or what have you, when they get wet, guess what? They also get slick. So until such time as the roofing industry can figure out how to address that, and there are roofing associations out there that are very concerned with everything related to their product, truly. Until they can come up with a solution, we have that now, and certainly the occupants, in the event of a fire when they're trying to make an escape, or certainly the firefighters when they're trying to effect rescues, are going to have to be very careful with those. Habitable attics. This criteria has been built into its own section, okay? And there's some interesting things that have been included in this that are more descriptive, I think, than anything else. But habitable attics, still there's a limitation on floor area based on whether it's sprinklered or not. Non-sprinklered is 1/3 of the area of the story below. Sprinklered is 1/2 of the area. Certainly, and I find item number 4, and I'll skip around here. HA is habitable attic, by the way. Habitable attic above a 3rd story in a sprinklered building, it can be there. What basically it says is that if you have a non-sprinklered building, it can't be there effectively. And we do know that there are many parts of the country that do not require sprinklers installed in dwellings. And so that would affect that. The funny ones are the 2nd and 3rd. We get that the occupiable space is bounded by the roof assembly, the sloping, if you will, rafters or trusses or whatever is in there. Floor assembly we get, and then it says knee wall. Well, I've seen conditions where they didn't provide a small knee wall, but okay, maybe it's blocking or whatever. It's just a very small knee wall and all that. You could have that bound the, if you will, or encompass the occupiable space, and then the floor area of the habitable attic does not extend beyond or out over the exterior walls of the floor below. I had never seen this particular condition, but some people have told me that there have been habitable attics converted when you have like a porch cover and they extend out into that cover. And so you basically have to cut that off, use a wall effectively, and that cuts it off, that sort of thing. Make sure there's proper ventilation, though, in that space that's created. Energy storage systems, we're getting towards the end of today's session. A lot of work on these, even more so than the photovoltaic now. The photovoltaic has had their time. They've worked quite a bit on certainly the criteria related to those that would go into the building codes themselves, including the residential code. The batteries, how we store the energy that is generated, has been a big concern. UL 9540 is the standard that is applied to these. We get that they're listed and labeled like so many other products. We get they're installed per the manufacturer's installation instructions. Then we have other criteria that is imposed, almost like amendments to a degree, although I think a lot of the manufacturers use these too. Each of the units must be no closer than 3 feet to another such ESS unit, okay, unless there's been fire testing. It says large-scale fire testing. We get that. Again, it's like an alternate. They provide you with testing that's specifically intended for that particular product, maybe in that particular configuration, and then you can evaluate it. And I would work certainly much more closely with the fire department on this, because they're the ones who have to respond to these fires. And if it gets in runaway mode, it's very difficult to respond and certainly to suppress. They can control, but the criteria that's built into the codes is intended to limit the exposure to the fire hazard based on these systems. We have the locations that are addressed here, the acceptable locations of these battery-like products. Detached structures, garages, accessory, whatever, you can have them there because obviously they're not as highly occupied, as you would find with the regular dwelling unit. Attached garages, so long as they're provided with the garage dwelling unit separation that we've already talked about today. Outdoors on exterior walls, so long as there's a 3-foot gap to any opening. Obviously, there's an inherent fire resistance for all products. Even gasoline-soaked rags, I suppose, could have some sort of fire resistance, albeit very short. But that basically allows for and considers that in allowing for them to be anywhere on the outside of the building. Obviously, zoning is going to, or planners are going to have a problem if they're in the front yard, but or side yard. But please make sure that they're properly separated. And then if you go into any sort of enclosed space, obviously we get the 5/8 type X, or we get non-combustible. We get non-combustible types of products that enclose these particular units, again, to give a little bit of time for the occupants to escape. It's kind of an interesting thing that we have to say this, but we do actually say where they're not allowed. And it's obvious that we don't allow them in sleeping rooms or in other types of spaces that open directly into sleeping rooms. It's amazing what people will do, certainly when they really aren't knowledgeable about codes. They're not knowledgeable about the fire hazards. And so one of the great things about this particular industry is that they're also very concerned about the installation, the application of these products. And so they don't encourage that. They want to have certainly qualified people who are knowledgeable actually doing the installations themselves. Now, we do have fire protection that's provided with that. Anytime you have, again, ESS installed, we get smoke alarms. So if they go into a problem mode, if you will, then hopefully the smoke alarms will detect that and then cause the occupants to leave, or certainly suppress or control the fire as much as possible. If you have an area, because if you see in that first bullet or the first sentence at the very top, here it says attached garages. Many smoke alarms, if not all smoke alarms, are not listed for unconditioned, if you will, garages, things of that nature. So when smoke alarms cannot be installed, right, then we get heat detectors. So this is the first case of actually getting heat detection into the residential code. Okay, those heat detectors are then interconnected into and with the smoke alarm system. Okay, obviously, when we're looking at new construction, the smoke alarm systems have to be at least communicate with each other. Okay, so that if one goes off, they all go off and they notify people in the dwelling, wherever they have to be within the dwelling. The same is true with heat detection. That may cause, frankly, the replacement of all of the smoke alarms so that it does work with the heat detectors too. So that's one of the challenges with the installation of these battery types of systems, these energy storage systems. Now, there is another challenge, is that we have to protect these batteries, these systems, from impact. Okay? The IRC just says approved barriers shall be used. Okay? The industry, in developing amendments to the state of California, has come up with a very handy diagram that's actually in the California Residential Code that details out to great degree the installation requirements for these energy storage systems, and certainly the protection features that are built in too. So I know that the industry is going to come back to ICC. I'm pretty sure they are, and provide that. My recommendation, you can see the side note here, is that the state of California criteria is very, very handy. And if you're a building official or a fire code official, whoever is enforcing this particular criteria, right, I would take a look at it at the very least, because it is fully supported by, it was developed by, to great expense, really, and time. There was a lot of time put into developing that diagram, and certainly the amendments that are found in the California codes. I would take a look at that and apply that then. Really interesting to go through all this and to see that, and you can reach out and use that. You can amend your code if you want, but I would highly recommend using that. With that, that is the end of today's session. I want to thank you all for listening. And now I'd like to open this up for questions.
All right. Thank you, Paul. That was a great presentation.
What kind of questions do we have, if any?
We've had a lot of questions, Paul, and I know everybody had a great time because you're such an engaging speaker, and that was a really great presentation. So first question that we'll jump into relates to the IEBC versus the IRC, specifically around here we go. Hang on, just lost it. There we go. The delineation between using the IRC or the IEBC for an addition or remodel. Is it possible to provide like an explanation on how a designer or an engineer would decide which code would be the appropriate one if you're adding on to an existing structure?
Well, from the perspective of people actually doing the design, my recommendation is to always contact the local jurisdiction, the city, the county, the state, whoever is actually doing or enforcing that particular code. There's a lot of areas within the United States that don't use the existing building code, and they use for existing work, if you will, additions, alterations, even repairs, the new building code, which would in this case be the IRC. In terms of actually diving into the application of the IEBC, we'll just say for myself, I would basically stick with what the IRC is referencing at this point in terms of changes of occupancy, other types of issues that are related to that, and then with just simple additions, alterations for the up to 3 stories with lofts and habitable attics and all the other stuff that can go into these residential code types of structures, I would lean very heavily on the IRC itself. It is a very simple prescriptive code. The IEBC requires more analysis, and frankly, I think would be a little more difficult to use, honestly, for single-family dwellings, duplexes, and probably for townhomes too.
Yeah, it might be a bit much. All right. Here's a question on on separation for townhouses and duplexes. Can those buildings be structurally connected for lateral stability purposes through the separation? I'm guessing that means the fire separation.
Wow, that is a great question, and one that is somewhat timely, but is related more to the IBC than the IRC. The IRC allows for the structural connection, if you will, if you want to call it that, between units. The building code, when you have firewalls, when you have that kind of a separation, it gets to be a little more difficult because there is a structural, if you will, integrity that's needed, that is something that is easier to do based on a building code type of provision, but is not called out at all in the residential code. There's no firewall criteria built into the residential code, at least at this point, and I'm hoping to be on the residential code committee this next time for, which is hard to say, the 2027 edition. It's getting kind of weird with all the years that are passing, but I would still speak against bringing in firewall conditions into the residential code. The residential code, I think, addresses the separation of units, whether they're townhomes or duplexes, pretty well as it is. So I hope that helps.
Absolutely. That was a great answer. Thank you. Okay, here's a short question. Can you give an example of a change of occupancy for a house?
Usually it goes to live work types of units, things like that. People are bringing in a business. They're converting homes, at least maybe the first floor into a business. Could be any sort of business, accountant, that kind of a thing. Professional services. I've seen beauty salons. I've seen, not that I go to beauty salons by any stretch of the imagination, but that kind of a thing. That would be a change in occupancy, and that's where we would start to dive into the use of the International Existing Building Code.
Okay. Okay, so here's a question relating to where do the IRC requirements stop? I think you had on slide 21, you were talking about stairs and ramps in the landscaping leading to the front door. And there was a question on whether or not section R301.1 does cover the exterior of the building, or does it not cover the exterior of the building?
The International Residential Code, as it was originally developed, was intended to only cover the building itself, not the grounds leading up to it. It would cover decks that are attached to it, obviously, or detached, that kind of thing, accessory buildings, site types of landscaping, pathways, circulation pathways, access around buildings or through properties, things of that nature were not intended to be covered by the International Residential Code.
All right, great. Question on fire and smoke alarms. Are they required to be hardwired and with a power backup in new construction?
Interesting question. Technology has changed. There are smoke alarm systems, there are carbon monoxide systems, and so on that are now wireless, if you will, in their capability of communicating with each other. I've seen this actually installed. There's security systems that are this way too. Trying not to use manufacturers much, but there are people or groups that will come out and install security, smoke alarm, fire alarm types of devices that have effectively no wiring in existing construction, and the only wiring in new construction is for the power for those devices themselves. It's good to check with the manufacturers of, again, I'm not going to try and use the names. There are some notable ones out there. And from what I understand, they pretty much all have those kinds of systems now.
Okay. I think we sort of talked about this, but I think this is a good question, and it's going to probably talk about something a little bit differently. Does the IRC address the termination of a separation wall at the roof?
Oh, the vertical continuity. Very interesting question. It does talk about that to a degree. It doesn't have the level of detail that we have for the horizontal continuity, that kind of a thing.
All right. Question on if you are 310.7.1 about replacement windows. Does this apply when a window is moved? If so, how far does it need to move such that it would not apply? So, if you're moving in
that question to me again.
Yeah, so replacement windows. So if a window is moved, how far does it need to move that it would not apply? So I guess if you are replacing a window and you're only moving it maybe an inch or two, does the code speak to, is there a limit on if it's a different size perhaps, or some details on the replacement window requirements?
Yeah, the replacement window situation is a little difficult. The challenge that we have is that certainly we can remove window assemblies without affecting the rough opening. But if we do touch the rough opening, whether it's an inch or 10 feet or whatever, then you're going to have to comply.
All right.
That's generally the interpretation. That's the opinion of a lot of building officials, fire officials, those kinds of folks out there.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Well, we are coming up on the half hour, so I'm going to thank you, Paul.
This concludes the American Institute of Architects Continuing Education Systems course. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.